welcome to the Rotary Times, a public service program presented by the Rotary Club of Falls Church, Virginia. On our programs, we talk with Rotarians and community leaders and discuss Rotary International and how it helps local, national, and world communities. I'm Rotarian Michael McCormack, your host, with the Rotary Club of Falls Church, Virginia, along with Rotarian Soo-Young Min, your co-host, with the Rotary Club of Bailey's Crossroads, Virginia. Our guest for this program is David Shaman, the author of the book, The World Bank Unveiled, Inside the Revolutionary Struggle for Transparency. David, welcome to the Rotary Times.
Thank you.
David, before we start talking about the World Bank and your book, how about telling us and our viewers a little bit about yourself and your background before you got involved with the World Bank?
Well, I grew up in New York City, and my background is that I got a degree in journalism from the University of Maryland and went back to New York. I worked for a couple of newspapers, including Newsday. And after that, I got a bug to get involved in politics. I worked in a political campaign for Mayor Ed Koch in 1985. That dates me a little bit, but after that, I worked in local New York City politics for several years, and I had a desire to see what Washington was like. And I began to explore opportunities to work in Washington. Came down to Washington in the late 1980s and began working on Capitol Hill for several legislators, and that's how I got involved in Washington.
Great.
Well, with that background, how does one become involved with the World Bank? Can you tell us
Well,
about
that's
how
a tricky question because I left politics and I was looking for new opportunities. And by a very circuitous route, I ended up in the World Bank. I had an opportunity to do some temporary work at the bank, and I joined a brand new research unit that had just formed, I think about a week before I arrived. And it was a research team that was focused on environmental economics, and the manager of the research unit needed somebody who had investigative skills, research skills. He found out that I had a background in journalism, and he asked me if I'd like to stick around and be part of the team, digging up data on environment and industrial pollution. And so it seemed like a good opportunity, and it led to a very long relationship.
Environmental economics, boy, that sounds like a little niche somewhere, but I guess for the World Bank, how does environmental economics and research in that fit into the World Bank programs?
Well, the World Bank has an extensive research department that it's primarily economics based, and it focuses on a variety of different sectors: transport, agriculture, and this was a brand new unit on the environment. Environmental economics was a growing field in the early 1990s when I joined the World Bank, which was in 1993. And so it was a growing awareness within the World Bank about the environment, about the importance of the environment, and about the impact of its policymaking on the environment. And so what they needed to do is they needed to create a research team that was focused on environmental economics that would basically help their operational activities understand the impacts of their lending and also offer new ideas and opportunities for them to explore lending activities.
Well, in terms of research, we live in an age where we Google everything. How does internet research affect your work?
Well, that's a kind of way down the road in our story, or in my story. The internet had a huge impact on our work in environmental economics. And to answer that, let me digress and give you a little bit of background information. When our research team formed in the early 1990s, we were basically trying to understand, in the absence of resources that regulators in Western societies have, like the United States or Japan or Western Europe, to do traditional monitoring of polluting activities in factories and enforcement of factories that are egregious polluters or do not adhere to the standards. What would environmental regulators in poor countries do? There was a prevailing assumption in the early 1990s in the field of environmental economics that poor countries would accept pollution as the price that they would pay to grow their economies and to develop. So we wanted to understand if that was true. And so we began researching this question and looking at some of the activities, informal activities, that regulators could employ in the absence of having the resources to do formal monitoring and enforcement activities. And what we learned was that, in fact, in very poor countries, there were factories that did pollute egregiously, but there were also factories that adhered to the standards. And in fact, there were some factories that would do better than the standards. The question became, why would they do that if they didn't have a regulator who had the power to enforce the standards? Why would they do better than the standards? So what we began to discover was that there were actually informal agents, community agents that would stand in place of the environmental regulators and negotiate on behalf of communities with local factories to force them to adhere to standards. Those negotiations could take the form of protests or boycotts or a range of other activities. But what we wanted to find out was how regulators could employ these informal activities into their own policy making. And that led us down a very interesting path, which was we began to work with the environmental agency in Indonesia called Bapedal on a pilot program that would use information disclosure to change factory behavior. And what this pilot program developed over 2 years with our inputs, was it would collect pollution data from factories, and then it would analyze that information, to assess whether they were meeting the standards, whether they were doing better than the standards, or whether they were not meeting the standards. And then the key component here was when they analyzed that information, there were two aspects of this which made the program unique, especially in the mid-1990s. And the first one is that the agency, with our help, gave this analysis a rating. In the case of PROPER, which was the name of this information disclosure system in Indonesia, it was a color-coded rating. Gold meant that a factory was doing world-class. Blue meant they were adhering to the standards. Black meant they were not doing so well. And so the second unique aspect of this was, in addition to giving the analysis a rating, they would disseminate that analysis to the public. They would disseminate the ratings to the public, either through the television, newspaper, radio. This had a profound impact on these factories. In many cases, these factories didn't know what their environmental performance was, and so for the first time they were understanding the impact that they were having on their communities. But in Indonesia, there's a special cultural aspect of Indonesia that is very important for folks to save face. So these polluting factories, especially the ones that were doing very poorly, were very worried about their reputation among their constituencies and consumers. And so what we learned in the 2 years of administrating and working with Bapedal was that pollution performance improved dramatically. The use of information disclosure, public information disclosure, was changing people's behavior in a very dramatic way. So then I'll get to your question, which was, how does the internet factor into this?
Before we get to that, let me back up and just, I heard like two different things. First, you mentioned that a lot of the groups or advocates that were helping or convincing or pressuring the various companies and plants to be more environmental friendly were not government agencies, but rather just local groups, whatever. And then in Indonesia, it was sort of the other way around, where there were government standards and there were checks and things done by, I'm assuming, some government agency. Are we talking two entirely separate methods that...
Yeah, I think there's a variety of aspects to this. In the first case, where we were talking about informal agents, they could be religious leaders, community activists who were sort of taking the lead in negotiating with local factories. In the second case, it was the agency that was taking the lead, but the key component here is that a lot of the research a lot of the work that was happening in Indonesia was actually based on work that had already taken place in the United States. This gets into a little bit of the weeds of the environmental history of our work. But in essence, what was happening was, in the United States, this type of activity was taking place, but the analysis was being done in the West by civil society agents. In Indonesia, civil society agents didn't really exist or didn't have the capacity to do it, so the agency was taking the lead with our inputs.
Now, can you tie that back to World Bank? How did that impact your work at the
Yeah,
World Bank?
I think there was two important trends that were taking place in the mid-1990s. This is a little bit of a long answer, but I think it's really key to understanding why this book was published and written. And the first of the two trends was the rise of the internet. In the mid-1990s, what we were doing was we were doing our research, and when we wanted to produce our research or publish our research, it would be a very long process of getting it refereed and getting it into a journal, and this would take a couple of years. The internet gave us an opportunity to disseminate this information immediately, and not just to academics and economists who are interested in industrial pollution, but to a wide audience, regulators, policymakers, the public as well. So that had a profound impact on what we were doing. The second aspect was civil society, and well, I can talk about that more in a bit.
David, we're going to take a short break. Please stay with us while we take a short break, and then we'll come back and talk more with David Shaman, the author of the book World Bank Unveiled. Please stay with us.
At the gateways to cities and towns across the globe, a familiar gear wheel signals. Rotary is here. Living their motto of service above self, more than 1 million Rotarian men and women worldwide support humanitarian work in your community and our world community. Service to youth, to the elderly, to the disabled, and the disadvantaged. In every corner of the globe, Rotary means friendship and helping others.
Welcome back to the Rotary Times. We're talking with David Shaman, the author of the book The World Bank Unveiled, Inside the Revolutionary Struggle for Transparency. David, before the break, we talked a lot about the environmental conditions and companies around the world and nations in different parts of the third world, especially the third world country, dealing with environmental conditions and the research you did. How did all of this research on these environmental conditions evolve into emphasizing transparency and accountability for the World Bank?
Well, we were learning some very important lessons in our research about the power of public information disclosure to change people's behavior. And a second lesson that we learned was when we created an internet site, we put our research out there, we found that we had a growing awareness among people who cared about this issue, but we also made it a platform for other people to opt in and to let and show their research on our website. So we created a very powerful engine on a niche subject, admittedly, industrial pollution. And people all over the world were watching our website, and regulators who had no relationship with us or the World Bank began implementing our research in their own locales or using our data sets in their own countries. We found that a profound experience because that was the second powerful lesson that we got on the power of information disclosure. In the mid-1990s, this internet trend was combining with another important trend that was happening, which was in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the World Bank had done some missteps in some lending activities that had caused great environmental harm in places such as Brazil and India. And that had prompted many civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations, community-based organizations to question whether the World Bank and other international financial institutions such as the IMF and the World Trade Organization, whether they are eradicating poverty or exacerbating poverty. And this culminated into large protest movements in the mid-1990s and of course in Seattle, and the World Trade Organization was very violent. And then in 2000 they came to the World Bank and they basically closed down Washington, D.C. for several days. Hundreds were arrested. So my colleagues and I were looking at this and trying to understand, we were inside the World Bank and we had many good people inside the bank who were trying to reduce poverty, cared about the same issues that these protesters were upset about. And we wanted to show